Well, hello, my friends. How's it going? There, got the camera going. I was going to talk a little bit about cannabis for a moment. You know, I've made a lot of videos about various herbs, and I used to actually have a cannabis channel here on YouTube, which is the one I'm using for my bus channel now. And it's because well, it's not because I quit smoking pot, it's because I just lost interest in growing it for a while. I had a medical card for a while because of my sciatic pain, and so I was using that to show and share my garden on YouTube. It was new and exciting, and I mean, I've been growing since I was younger, but of course back then it was illegal, and today there are various laws depending on where you live in the legal state, whether or not you're a medical supplier or you have a card of your own. See, Washington State, you can't grow your own cannabis plants. With Oregon, for example, next door, they can grow 3 plants per person, per household, with up to a maximum. But I'm not going to get into the technicalities here. I'm really here to talk about cannabis itself and the absurdity of the propaganda that was put out, all the way from the 30s with reefer madness all the way until now. I grew up in a culture where we laughed at reefer madness. We watched it in high school as a joke, or junior high, and it was kind of like a, even then, none of us were even pot smokers yet, but I very much enjoy cannabis, and I'll tell you, it goes way beyond getting stoned. When I was a kid, teenager, I was a stoner. I mean, we'd ditch school to go out and smoke weed in the woods, and get out of school, and we'd go meet in the woods. We'd always hang out in the parks. And it was a combination of cannabis and psychedelics which really put me in this, a love of nature, to go out and really, go camping and commune with nature, if you will. And it's brought me many great things in my life, my experiences with drugs, but at the same time, of course, I realized the damage that they can do if you're not careful with them. And this is why it's... there's always going to be somebody who, if I make a video, for example, about a particular substance, even something as benign as kratom, they'll go on to talk about the dangers and the addiction and how hard it was for them to quit and how they had to suffer for like 3 or 4 days of feeling restless. And I say, hey, if 3 or 4 years of feeling better from your pain can, and wind up with a few days of feeling a little crappy because you didn't taper, that's a small price to pay. Like, I've been down so many roads. I know what a withdrawal feels like. I know what pain feels like as well. And I've been through enough in my life to know, as a responsible adult, I can decide what I consume. But when it comes to cannabis, it is so off the charts benign. It is so non-harmful, and so generally the issue with cannabis isn't with the plant itself. It's not the dangers of inhaling it. It's not the dangers of eating it. And it's not the dangers of how high it makes you. It's a person who takes no responsibility, decides to just be a pot smoker and not do anything else, which they are the minority. I know a majority of pot smokers who lead normal, productive lives, men and women you would never expect, all walks of life, all ages. It's always been that way. And it's just that the people that don't walk around wearing pot leaf shirts and bragging about smoking pot, you wouldn't expect them to be pot smokers. But everyone has their own reason for smoking it. And up until the medical benefits started to come out, nobody even really had a for sure reason why they enjoyed it. They said, well, I have this condition and I smoke pot and it seems to help. I mean, and there was no way to do any medical study on it. And we fought for legalization for, decades. Even when I was a kid, I was trying to get it legalized. And lo and behold, this is what inspired me to make this video. I go into my cabinet now and I pull these out. These are all the empty packages from legal cannabis that I can buy at the corner store a few blocks away. So we've got Snickle Fritz Cannabis Supply Company. This is Purple Kush. What do we got here? We've got Fire Cannabis. We've got a hybrid 22%. Blue Dream. We've got another fire one, another hybrid fire brand. And this is Gorilla Glue number 4, 21% off THC. Fire Smalls Flow, 7 grams, 23.2%. Pretty strong stuff. Although THC is not what it's all about, I'll get back to that. Here's a Trichome brand, Larry OG. I really like OG Kushes. This is Girl Scout cookies. And this is an ounce of weed. Now here's one from a candy that I got. It was just a little candy my wife bought me when I was sick. And I like edibles too. This right here, bag o' weed. This says it all right here. It's a bag o' weed. It's a hybrid bag o' weed. Girl Scout cookies. It's grown in Washington State. 1 ounce of pot for $80. Now, if you don't smoke cannabis, you don't know much probably about the pricing and whatnot, but when I was growing up in the 90s, an ounce of cannabis here would go for about $250 to $350, depending through that whole decade. And it would depend on the strain. Of course, you could get Mexican for $80-90 an ounce, really dirt weed with seeds in it. But the good weed generally went for about $280, and there's 28 grams in an ounce, so you're looking at $10 a gram. So now, now that it's commercially available, you can get it for $80 an ounce if you're willing to go with smaller buds. And I just find I have such mixed feelings about this whole thing, which is another thing, a reason I wanted to talk about the legal cannabis aspect. It's phenomenal. So you can go to the store, you can buy pot, and it's changed everything. But at the same time, we forget that, in some states they've actually fought to legalize it, and the people have voted against it, not because of the cannabis, but because of the conditions of the legalization. A lot of these guys say, yeah, we'll legalize it as long as you put us in control of all of the pot industry over here. And so the people voted against it because they said, no person should monopolize the industry. And that's what they've been doing from the beginning. If pharmaceutical industries can't patent something, for example, then they'll find a synthetic version. And if they can't do that, then they'll try to own the industry through some other means. And it happens. This is what tobacco is. It's regulated. It's grown by farmers, but it's regulated and taxed, and all the profits. Do you think that these extra taxes on cigarettes actually go to help people who, might need it or are affected by smoking? Of course not. It wouldn't make much sense to tax people from smoking only to help them, but maybe it would, better than helping the pockets of big companies. So I don't want to get into the pharma and the money aspect, but when it comes to cannabis, they're capitalizing on it as much as they can too. Basically, if a company can't fight something, then they try to profit on it. It makes it very difficult out there for the kratom industry, because that's what's happening right now, and it's where this is leading. This is leading into a controlled market. The difference is that cannabis can be grown in households everywhere, and it's always been known. You can fight against cannabis, but anyone can grow it anywhere, and it grows like a weed, literally, indoors or outdoors, and in most climates in America. When it comes to kratom, it'll only grow in the southern states here, and if they made it illegal and banned it outright, it would take too long to grow enough to supply the demand. So they want to control it through other markets like the banks. And this is why, say, as a kratom vendor, I can't find a processor, a credit card processor, because none of them will work with us. Well, the same thing happens in the cannabis industry. Even the legal CBD market right now, they're unable to get any type of help from most banks or processors. But then some unscrupulous, companies will create offshore accounts and say, "Oh, we'll help you out," and it just creates an entire mess. Here in Washington, and I believe it's still this way, since cannabis industry can't work with banks, at least in most cases, then what they do is they actually keep all of their money in cash, and they will seriously transport hundreds of thousands of dollars, down to the state capitol to pay their taxes in cash. It's the only way for them to do it. And, there was a case recently where these guys were actually held up, I believe, and their car was stolen or something down in California, when they were transporting a bunch of weed cash. But it was their whole business for the year and all their money to feed their family and everything for all of them. So you got to be careful out there in that industry, I guess. But I guess the point I'm kind of trying to make on that is that even when you have something illegal and it's accessible to the people, the cartels always make their mark, and they always find a way to get their share, if you will. And these cartels are not Mexicans in hoods or Italian mafia bosses or anything. These are guys in suits that work for us, that we hire to work in our government. These are groups that take advantage of what we have all created for ourselves, and try to put their thumb on the free market so they can make their profit off of it. And, you know, anything that people are interested in always gets recognized and they want to ban it, you know. I can give you the perfect example before I go here. Look at what happened with salvia. Do you remember salvia? Most people know what it is. It's still legal in most states, but there was a huge deal about it about 10 to 12 years ago. All of a sudden, salvia was this big problem. Kids were getting all messed up on salvia, and it was going to be the next big drug craze and the new psychedelic. That people are going to go nuts and run around naked. And a few people did, and then it faded away. It's not that interesting. And if you go out and you ask 100 psychedelic users, what do you think of salvia? And then most of them will say, man, I won't touch that shit anymore. Or, it was interesting a couple times. But the point is that these things that are considered to be this big craze are not the big crazes. You hear of a few stories, a few extreme stories. And the same thing with people who had this crazy kratom addiction. I have this story I was going to read, actually, when I made a kratom video. It was called How Kratom Ruined My Life. And it shows this, you know, stock photo of like a silhouette of somebody holding their head in their arms. So I read the whole article, and it was pretty long. And it was this guy, at first talks about how he was an alcoholic and his whole life was messed up. But then all of a sudden, he got a job, and then he found kratom, and then somehow over a couple of years, kratom ruined his life, even though his life was shit before that. But by the very end, he says, you know, actually kratom's very helpful and very useful to a lot of people, and, you know, basically doesn't even attribute it really to the kratom, saying that, yeah, we all make our own choices, you know. Addiction is something that people have, and addiction is when you're consuming something or doing something that affects your life negatively. And when it comes to cannabis, there is no physical addiction with cannabis. I would like to put that outright. No matter what people say about, you know, other drugs or substances, cannabis being as strong as it is, and I'll tell you this because in 2012, I believe it was, I quit smoking for 2 years. I'd been smoking for about 22, 23 years up to that point, consistently. I mean, I quit for like a 5-month period years before that, a decade before that. But I've been smoking every single day, multiple times. You know, what, 3 grams a day, 2 to 3 grams a day maybe, or maybe a little less, depending on the day, of course. And then all of a sudden, one day on the November 15th, I said, okay, I have to quit because I have to be responsible for my kids. I was on probation for some mushrooms, and I said, well, I don't want to get a dirty UA. I had to take drug tests. So I quit, cold turkey, that night. For 2 days, I just kind of, I was like, okay, well, I don't smoke pot anymore. And then the mental aspect of it was kind of like bored, like, what should I do now? Well, it's the same thing I'd be doing anyway. And I went on with my life. It didn't affect me. It didn't bother me. It didn't ruin my life. It didn't make me feel shitty for a week, or having headaches or palpitations or jonesing for kratom or for weed. And that's very interesting to think of, something that strong that has no physical addiction. It's pretty fascinating though, because when I've quit smoking in the past, let's say cigarettes, there have been times when I quit when I was younger where it was so hard to quit, and then other times where I would quit for like 2 years and just say, oh, doesn't even fit, you know, just quit one day because I'm inspired to do it. And it's all in the head. The mental aspect, how we look at these things, is so crucial, and that's why we have to stop blaming these substances for our problems. It's not the substances. It's our own lives. It's loneliness is what causes addiction and problems. It's us missing out on a certain part of our lives, or not having enough connection in our lives, really, that causes this circle of addiction with any substance. Relapse, falling into a bad way of life or a bad crowd, going to jail, getting out, doing it all over again. And I'm glad I got out of the circle of drug tests because I know how that works. They get you in the system and they just take you for every penny they can, put you through their classes. And the prison industry, that whole complex is a story I'd love to just cover in depth sometime, because it's appalling to me. Nobody out here ever sees what goes on inside the jails, but you don't realize half those people are in there for drugs, okay? Or more, and most of them for just consuming some, or maybe selling some to help feed their family. You know, there's tons of stories of people who have to sell crack, you know, to help pay their mom's hospital bills, that kind of stuff. It's the reality of life. Nobody wants to be a drug dealer. They see good money in it. They see other people doing it. It's a social condition. It's like, if people want to say don't blame guns for the problems, blame the culture, you could say the same thing about drugs. Don't blame drugs for the problems. You blame the culture. And that's why when I heard somebody when I heard the president say that, you know, he was going to build a wall and stop all drugs from coming over to the U.S., I just laughed. I'm like, you missed the whole point. You just don't get it. These people are just so out of touch. So I got way off of track from cannabis there, but really what I wanted to do is paint a broader picture of what this country has become, how we've tried to control the influx of not just drugs, but of information, and given us ourselves faulty outlooks on what the world really, or what drugs really are, what substances really are. You know, since we legalized cannabis in Washington, it's been a couple of years now. The kids aren't dropping out of school in record numbers. There's no increase in cannabis-related homicides or accidents. It's the same as it's always been, because it doesn't matter if it's legal or not. It's the people who want to access it will access it. Sure, there was kind of a rush and a novelty, and everyone who hadn't smoked pot in a while said, "Hey, I want to try it now that it's legal." But you know, for those of us who had always smoked, it didn't really matter much. It was just kind of another shift in thinking. I hope corporate America doesn't take this one over too. So we need to keep the plants and the powers in the hands of the people. The plants always have to be in the hands of the people. Got these two, I was just going to show these cannabis culture, you know, it's like the High Times, you know, those kinds of magazines, just all the stuff we grew up on. But two of my favorites are the Canna Bible and the Canna Bible 2. And they're basically books. It's cannabis porn. It's just full of all the different strains. And not all the different strains, but at least all the ones back then. I mean, it goes on for miles now. Cannabis is actually, the genetics have just been tainted to the point where they just shit much of the time these days. It's just the same old, same old. And any cannabis connoisseur from the 90s would tell you, yeah, dude, there was some really amazing lime green, sticky stuff that just, you can't define it. And that's the thing about cannabis. It's not just about the high or how high you can get. It's about the balance of effects of the several cannabinoids in it, as well as the flavor, the aroma. The terpenes play a huge role in cannabis, and those terpenes are so versatile and varied within cannabis that I could go on and on. I've made several videos about terpenes, and I'll get into that some other time. But thanks for listening, and keep cannabis legal where you live, but make sure that it's not being monopolized. You know, if it's at all possible, be careful, be wary. And remember that it's a plant, and it should remain in the people's hands. So, take care, everyone.